Now let's talk about explicit transactions. This is something you're going to hear about and read about in various pieces of documentation, whether you're looking at Microsoft's version of relational databases or Oracle's or anybody else's. And when we're talking about an explicit transaction, we're talking about exactly what you saw me demonstrate in the video entitled Understanding Transactions. So if you haven't seen that video, you might want to go take a look at it, Understanding Transactions, because in that video I did explicit transactions. Now, an explicit transaction is where I actually code the begin transaction command, or begin tran is a short version, a commit transaction, and or a rollback transaction. Now, you should get in the habit in any development that you do, especially in stored procedures, that anytime you make a change to a database, that you begin a transaction, make your changes, do your inserts, updates, deletes, check for errors, and if an error is raised, before you even determine what the error is, roll back the transaction. Then figure out what you need to do to correct your error, or it's hard to generalize there, but the bottom line is you want to check for error conditions, and I'll give you some ideas when we look at stored procedures. But you want to make sure that everything looks like what you want before you commit the transaction, and of course, once you see it, commit that transaction. Now let me just tell you this, the longer you leave these transactions open, the more locking you have on the database. If that makes sense, good. If it doesn't, don't worry about it right now. But open transactions will cause the database to place locks on everything you're updating, and it will not release that lock until you either commit or roll back that transaction. But I just want you to know that explicit transactions are where we actually write the code. Here's something that will confuse you. SQL Server 2008 out of the box utilizes implicit transactions, but they call this auto commit on insert, update, and delete statements. Because if you'll think about it, if you've ever written an insert, update, or delete statement, you didn't mention anything about beginning a transaction, rolling back a transaction, or committing a transaction, but your data went into the database. What's happening in the background is anytime you do an insert, update, or delete in SQL Server 7, 2000, 2005, or 2008, SQL automatically in the background commits the data for you. It more or less writes a begin tran, then it puts your command, then it does a commit tran. So all of your changes just get committed. And so you can kind of grab some of the power back and protect yourself by using these begin, rollback, and commit transaction statements around all of your code. You can change this functionality, and in other products, for example, Oracle's database products do not use auto commit out of the box, and so just be aware that if you're ever developing any code that's going to run on Oracle machines. So I just want you to understand what explicit transactions are. I want you to understand that SQL Server is using implicit transactions, and you can set those off. If you go out there in the books online, you can look at set implicit transactions. That's a command, set implicit transactions, and you can see you can turn those on and off. Now here's one thing you need to think about. If I'm not using implicit transactions, if I turn that off and I do an insert, well, that insert never gets committed unless I actually type commit transaction. And so that insert will show up until the server restarts, and since that was never committed, it gets erased out of the transaction log, and suddenly the data that used to be there is no longer there. So you need to know whether you're working in implicit or explicit. And the bottom line is when you're coding changes to a database, you should always use explicit transactions. Begin that transaction, carry out your actions, check for errors, either roll it back or commit it at that point. I hope that helps you understand. I hope I hadn't confused you with all this babbling, but that's what explicit transactions are. You might want to go out in books online and read about this, get a good picture in your brain.